Welcome to this short video on Richard Mayer's 12 multimedia learning principles. These principles are meant to guide you through creating effective multimedia learning materials. So if you're planning on creating content like video lectures or presentations, online courses, keep these in mind when designing your lessons. The educational psychologist Richard Mayer produced the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. This theory basically says that our brains process data through two separate This theory basically says that our brains process data through two separate cognitive channels for auditory and visual information. Obviously, auditory information includes stuff like written text on screen, icons, the presentations, images, graphics, whatever you'd like to show and present to the viewer. And meanwhile, visual information is what the learners would hear. So that's someone narrating, that could be music, just someone speaking, basically. Anything that goes through your ears and straight into your brain. Humans have limited working memory in each channel, which can be quickly overwhelmed if too much information is presented at once. If either channel is overloaded, it can impede learning because the brain cannot effectively process, organize, and integrate the information. So, for example, try not to bog down your presentation with too many visual elements or long, dense narrations. The key to helping learners is with dual channel processing. The brain processes information more effectively when both of these channels are used in a balanced way. So, for example, presenting relevant narration with complementary visuals and graphics allows the brain to process the information through two channels simultaneously without overloading one channel. Learners who learn from dual coded materials generally gain a deeper understanding of the material, and this is because of effective info management. This enables students to engage in active cognitive processes like selecting the relevant info going into each channel, organizing that into mental representations they can understand, and forming new connections between the knowledge they've learned and already existing knowledge. Teaching is better when the learners are actively engaged in the process of learning rather than passively just receiving the information. Now, these 12 principles are sorted under three main purposes. First are the principles focusing on reducing extraneous processing. What's that? That's basically cognitive processing being allocated to other things during learning that don't serve the instructional goal. So imagine background music or really complicated graphics that could take away from the presentation. Under this group are coherence, signaling, redundancy, spatial contiguity, and temporal contiguity. Next are the principles on managing essential processing. Basically, this asks, how do I best present the information to be learned? Here, we will find segmenting, pre-training, and modality. Lastly, we have the principles on fostering generative processing. These will help learners organize the material into their working memory so that the info can get eventually encoded into long-term memory. So in the first group, we'll talk about the first 5 principles. These deal with simplifying the information that we need to present to our learners. First is the coherence principle. Cut out unnecessary information, keep the content simple, get straight to the point. Keep only what learners need and cut out any elements that could distract or don't directly contribute to the main message, even if they are interesting. We have two presentation slides here. The one on the left is full of stimuli. There's interesting background decor, graphics to catch your eye, and a long bunch of text. Add spoken narration, and that'll be a lot to process for the viewers. The right side is simplified to only retain simple icons and the text of the key points to be discussed by the speaker. Signaling. Direct the learner's attention to where it needs to be, like key points or the flow of information. This can be done by using signals or cues like highlights, arrows, bold text, anything meant to emphasize key information. You can see the difference here. The example on the right has bolded words that immediately draws the viewer's attention to them. When learners are directed on where to go, that takes off some additional cognitive processing off their shoulders. Because the alternative here would have your students be spending energy on trying to navigate what they're looking at in the first place. Redundancy. People learn best when graphics or text complement spoken presentations, but avoid using all of them at once. If you are, try to keep either graphics or text to a minimum. Avoiding redundancy lessens the stuff people need to keep track of. On the left slide, you can see that there's a lot of information on screen. There's already graphics and text, then a picture, and imagine a speaker talking over that and saying something slightly different from the stuff already on screen. Learners will have to spend mental load to process all of these inputs, which are all trying to say the same thing anyway. The right slide is far simpler in a presentation context, giving learners the key point and giving their cognitive processing some room to better understand what the speaker will be talking about. Next is spatial contiguity. Keep all relevant text and visuals physically close together. Make it easy for the audience to know where to look for information. Again, it'll save them the mental load. On the left, even with pointers, the text is far away from the card, so it's like the viewers had to spend some mental load following the path to the visual representations. Placing the card values, the text, right under the card representations, the graphics, is much more effective because it takes you less time to look. And lastly, for this category is temporal contiguity. Present corresponding words and relevant visuals together rather than sequentially. Make sure voiceovers are timed with the right visuals or animations. For example, you shouldn't teach a process and then view an image of it afterwards. It should be shown with the lecture. Look at the left and imagine the image being shown first before being told that Milo is an alien. The image and words are referring to the same information, so it's far more effective to present them together. Make sure to give the audience time to process each element so that they can form connections, which is far easier to do once they have an overall gist of the information or presentation instead of needing to wait for the information to be presented sequentially. So this next group are the principles under managing essential processing, which are how to handle the inherent cognitive demands of the learning material. Essential processing basically refers to the quote unquote mental effort needed to understand the content and the concepts of the material being presented. These will help guide you in figuring out how to best present the information to be taught and to ease your learners with selecting, organizing, and integrating relevant info into meaningful mental representations. So the first in this group is segmenting. Break down complex information into manageable chunks and let learners go at their own pace, or else they might get overloaded with info. Most learning materials already give students the controls to pause, skip, or return to certain segments of the material to go over what they need to. Online learning modules have units that are often broken up into digestible parts as well, so that learners won't be subjected to too much info at once. So as you can see here, here's our YouTube video with user controls, as opposed to imagine a sort of live stream that the users cannot control and that they are forced to keep up with rather than go at their own pace. Needing to keep up with all of that and not being able to go back on what you missed could take a toll on the learner's mental load, mental effort in that case, the cognitive demands. And that's what we are trying to avoid as educators using multimedia learning principles. Next is the pre-training principle. People learn more efficiently if they already know some of the basics. This usually means that they should understand some key concepts and integral definitions before diving into more detailed topics. You can't expect someone to immediately create a website from scratch if they don't have any experience at all, right? The most common way to do this is by giving your learners an introduction to the topic that they're about to tackle. For example, I can only delve into these principles now because I introduced Mayer's cognitive theory earlier in the video. And all of these 12 principles are based off of that. Because you understand that managing the load in cognitive processing is key to retaining the learned information, it's easier to grasp what these principles are trying to do in order to make that sort of management easier. Next is modality. Graphics and spoken words work better than graphics and printed words. Again, try not to cram the audience with too much information and attempt to strike a balance. This isn't to say that text on screen is bad, but try to limit it to only what's needed. We're going to be reusing the example from an earlier slide to demonstrate. The example on the right is far better suited to complement a sort of fast paced presentation with narration over it, especially if the audience is already familiar with most of the words the speaker is using and some of the ideas that the speaker is talking about. It allows for a better sort of flow. That's not to say that the left example is like useless, like, oh, it's terrible. Like, no, graphics and print can still be useful though. It all depends on context. The left example is better off as some sort of reading lesson material, especially when it could include technical terms and symbols. But for the most part, the 12 principles of multimedia learning uh, would prefer spoken word presentations accompanied by graphical representations, for example. Now, we're at fostering generative processing. This last group covers the principles concerning organizing information to help encourage learners in actively engaging with the content. Constructing connections between the stuff they've learned helps them make better sense of it all. Things like self explanation, summarizing, and creating analogies, we want them to engage in selecting, organizing, and integrating the knowledge being taught to them. Most of these principles are rather intuitive and more so felt, so to speak. So here we have the multimedia principle. People learn best from words and pictures than just words. Remember the auditory and visual channels from earlier? Using a combination of words and specific pictures helps learners grasp a concept easily. So, for example, you could learn about the rock cycle via text as shown on the left. However, you can see that on the right, the visual containing the graphics and the text immediately gives the viewer how all of the rock types are connected to each other. It just makes so much more sense to see a representation in front of you, and it makes it easier to explain. Next is personalization. Learning with multimedia works better when it's focused on the user, focused on the audience. Try to avoid an overly formal tone and speak in a conversational manner in order to engage viewers as if you were talking to them. This is because learners are more likely to engage when they're feeling like they're being interacted with. Consider the language being used too, and make sure it is accessible to your specific audience. Like right now, I'm referring to you, my audience, by you, because that's who I'm speaking to. Next is the voice principle. People prefer to hear real voices over machine voiceovers. Real voices, human voices, feel more authentic, more mature, emotional, and relatable. And learners are more likely to trust and pay attention to content presented with actual narration over machine generated robotic voices. This also ties into the personalization principle somewhat. Again, people are more likely to engage in active cognitive processing when they perceive a social interaction with the speaker. And last but not least, the image principle. The speaker's image is not necessarily needed when presenting. The speaker's image could also be distracting and could take focus away from the main message, the main content being delivered. It's better to keep relevant and meaningful visuals that align with the narration. So here, the example on the right has the presenter's slide on screen only, while the left example has the presenter's video camera open alongside it. The speaker's video takes up around the same space as the presentation, which can add a layer of extraneous cognitive processing for the learners, and that's what we're trying to avoid. The speaker's image can be useful sometimes, though, like when they're introducing themselves to the audience to build a connection between them, but ideally it should be limited to only that. And that is it for the 12 Principles of Multimedia Learning. Thank you for sitting through this video, and if you would like any further readings, you can always go online and read Richard Mayer's Multimedia Learning book. And he just has a lot of interesting viewpoints and theories regarding in multimedia and how it can be used for all sorts of educational purposes and how it exactly affects learners and stuff. So definitely check that out.